In episode 16, titled Reporting: What a Strong Report Includes, we're going to focus on why the report is not a clerical afterthought, but the product that turns technical work into decisions. Pen Test Plus scenarios often test whether you understand that discovery and proof only matter if the results can be communicated in a way that leaders and engineers can act on safely. A strong report reduces confusion, supports prioritization, and protects everyone involved by being precise about scope, evidence handling, and what was actually validated. It also preserves credibility because vague or contradictory reporting can undermine even excellent technical work. The report is where you demonstrate discipline, not only in what you found, but in how you reasoned, how you handled sensitive data, and how you stayed within authorization. By the end of this episode, you should be able to picture the major report components and the professional qualities that make them useful. A report is written for multiple audiences, and strong reporting acknowledges that different readers need different kinds of information. Leaders generally need outcomes. What risk exists, what impact is likely, what should be done first, and what decisions or resources are required. Engineers and technical owners need details: what was observed, what evidence supports the finding, how it can be reproduced safely, and what specific changes will reduce risk. Security teams may sit between those groups, wanting both the narrative and the technical proof so they can prioritize remediation and tune detections. Legal and compliance stakeholders may also care about authorization boundaries, confidentiality, and whether evidence handling and disclosures align with obligations. When a report is written as if only one audience exists, it either becomes too shallow to fix issues or too dense to support decisions. A strong report is structured so that each audience can find what they need without wading through what they do not. The executive summary exists to give leaders a clear understanding of risks, impacts, and priority actions without forcing them to decode technical detail. It should communicate the overall posture, highlight the most important findings, and explain what makes them important in terms of business consequences. Priority actions should be stated plainly so decision makers can align resources and timelines quickly, and they should reflect realistic sequencing rather than an idealized fix everything at once expectation. A good executive summary avoids jargon and avoids exaggeration, because credibility is more valuable than drama when decisions are on the line. It also respects scope by being clear about what was tested and what was not, because leaders often assume a report covers more than it actually does. On exam-style questions, the executive summary concept is about outcomes and priorities, not about listing every technical detail that was collected. A methodology section explains what you did, when you did it, and why those actions were reasonable given the objectives and constraints. This section supports defensibility because it creates a clear link between authorization, the chosen approach, and the evidence produced. It also helps readers interpret findings correctly by understanding how the environment was assessed and what assumptions were made. Methodology should describe the engagement flow in a way that is transparent without being a play-by-play of commands or low-level steps. Timing matters here because it clarifies what constraints may have influenced testing depth, such as limited windows or change freezes, and it helps correlate observations with operational events. When methodology is clear, it reduces disputes because stakeholders can see that the work followed a consistent, approved structure. Clear findings are the core of the report, and a strong finding is usually structured around 4 elements: the issue, the evidence, the impact, and the recommendation. The issue should be stated in plain terms so the reader understands what is wrong without needing to infer it from technical fragments. Evidence should be specific enough to support credibility and to enable validation, but not so detailed that it creates unnecessary exposure or turns the report into an abuse manual. Impact should translate the issue into real-world consequence, aligned with the business context and the affected asset's role, rather than relying on generic fear language. The recommendation should be actionable, realistic, and aligned with ownership and sequencing, meaning it should point to what should change and in what order. When these elements are present, the finding becomes a decision-ready unit rather than an interesting technical story.
Evidence handling language is a professional signal that you treated data responsibly, which matters because penetration testing often touches sensitive information, even when the goal is not data collection. A strong report describes that evidence was collected minimally, stored securely, and handled in a way that protects confidentiality and reduces risk. Redaction should be applied thoughtfully so that the report proves the point without exposing sensitive data broadly, and this includes removing unnecessary identifiers while keeping enough context for engineers to act. The goal is to balance transparency with protection, because stakeholders need proof, but they do not need bulk data copied into a document. Evidence handling language also clarifies retention expectations, such as how long artifacts are kept and who can access them, which supports governance and reduces future risk. On Pen Test Plus scenarios, disciplined evidence handling is often the difference between a professional answer and an unsafe one. Risk statements should separate severity, likelihood, and business impact, rather than collapsing them into a single vague claim. Severity communicates technical seriousness, meaning what the weakness can enable from a technical standpoint if it is exploited. Likelihood communicates probability in this environment, meaning how exposure, controls, monitoring, and attacker effort shape feasibility. Business impact communicates consequence, meaning what harm would occur to mission, money, safety, or trust if the issue is used successfully. Separating these improves prioritization because it prevents the common mistake of treating the scariest technical issue as automatically the most urgent business issue. It also supports honest communication because you can be precise about what is known, what is inferred, and what is context-dependent. When a report uses risk language cleanly, decision-makers can prioritize remediation based on both feasibility and consequence rather than on rhetorical intensity. An attack narrative connects steps into a coherent story, and its purpose is to show how individual findings relate to one another in a way that reflects realistic pathways. Instead of presenting issues as isolated bullets, a narrative explains how one step enabled the next, how trust boundaries were crossed, and what evidence supports the sequence. This is especially useful when the engagement demonstrates how small weaknesses combine into meaningful impact, because stakeholders often underestimate risk when they see only individual fragments. A good narrative also supports defensive improvement by highlighting where detection and prevention failed along the path, not just where a vulnerability existed. The narrative should remain within scope and avoid sensational detail, focusing on what was validated and what the consequences were in the context described. On the exam, narrative thinking often appears when questions ask you to describe impact, prioritize fixes, or explain how an attacker could chain actions. Reproduction guidance needs a careful balance, enough detail for fixing and verification, but not so much that it enables abuse by turning the report into a step-by-step exploitation guide. The purpose of reproduction guidance is to help engineers confirm the issue and test the effectiveness of remediation changes without having to guess what was observed. That means providing clear conditions, affected components, and observable indicators that show whether the issue is present or resolved.
It does not mean publishing overly operational attack procedures that could be misused if the report is shared too widely or mishandled. This balance is part of professional responsibility, and it aligns with the idea of minimum necessary disclosure. When the exam hints at reporting best practices, it often rewards answers that provide actionable reproduction guidance while maintaining safety and confidentiality. Assumptions and limitations are essential because they set honest boundaries around what the report can claim, and they protect credibility by preventing overreach. Scope boundaries clarify what targets were included and excluded, which prevents stakeholders from assuming coverage that did not exist. Time limits clarify whether testing depth was constrained and whether certain areas could not be explored fully within the engagement window. Access constraints clarify what permissions existed and what kinds of validation were possible, which affects what conclusions can be drawn. Assumptions should be stated plainly so readers understand what was inferred versus what was directly observed. And limitations should be framed as context rather than excuses. When assumptions and limitations are explicit, the report becomes more trustworthy because it aligns claims with evidence and clarifies where uncertainty remains. Remediation guidance should be written in a style that supports real implementation, meaning it should recommend specific actions, assign likely owners, and reflect realistic sequencing. Specific actions are important because vague guidance like improve security does not help engineers change systems. Ownership matters because remediation requires accountability, and a report that recognizes who is likely to implement a change is more likely to be acted upon. Sequencing matters because some fixes reduce risk quickly and enable safer improvements later, and stakeholders need to know what order makes sense. Guidance should also respect operational constraints, such as change control processes and maintenance windows, because recommendations that ignore reality are often ignored in return. A strong report does not just identify problems, it supports a practical path to improvement. Quality checks are what separate a credible professional report from a rushed document, and they often show up as consistency, clarity, and removing contradictions. Consistency means that terms are used the same way throughout. Severity and impact reasoning aligns across sections, and findings do not conflict with one another due to careless wording. Clarity means that sentences are precise, jargon is controlled, and each finding can be understood without excessive interpretation. Removing contradictory statements matters because contradictions undermine trust and can lead to remediation confusion, especially when different stakeholders read different sections. Quality checks also include verifying that scope statements are accurate, that evidence references are consistent, and that recommendations align with the described constraints. On Pen Test Plus style questions, the mindset is that reporting is part of the discipline of testing, not a separate administrative task done at the end. In plain order, a strong report typically flows from audience-focused summary to defensible structure and then into actionable detail. It starts with an executive summary that communicates risks, impacts, and priority actions, then explains methodology so readers understand what was done and why it supports the findings. It presents findings in a consistent structure supported by disciplined evidence handling and clear risk statements that separate severity, likelihood, and business impact. It may include an attack narrative to connect steps into a coherent story that reflects realistic pathways and helps defenders and leaders understand how weaknesses combine. It provides reproduction guidance that supports fixing without enabling abuse, and it states assumptions and limitations so claims remain honest and bounded. It closes with remediation guidance that is specific, owned, and realistically sequenced, supported by quality checks that ensure clarity and consistency throughout. In this episode, the essential point is that strong reporting, turns technical work into action by being clear, defensible, and audience-aware. Leaders need outcomes and priorities. Engineers need evidence and fixable guidance. And the report must serve both without compromising confidentiality or safety. Findings should be written as issue, evidence, impact, and recommendation, with risk language that separates severity, likelihood, and business impact to support honest prioritization. Methodology, assumptions, and limitations protect credibility by showing what was done, under what constraints, and what conclusions are justified by evidence. Attack narratives and reproduction guidance add value when they clarify pathways and support remediation without enabling abuse. And quality checks prevent contradictions that erode trust. Now, outline one finding mentally by stating the issue in one sentence, the evidence you would cite, the impact in business terms, and the recommendation as a realistic next step, because that is the habit that makes reporting consistently strong. When that structure becomes automatic, your technical work consistently becomes decisions rather than just observations. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.